Yeah.
Hello, I'm
Hello.
Atul Bhardwaj. In next 20 minutes, I'll be discussing with Professor Inderjeet Parmar about the paleo-conservatives in America and the direction in which they're taking their country and the world. Inderjeet Parmar is a professor of international politics at City University of London. He's a visiting professor at LSE IDEAS, the premier foreign policy think tank of the London School of Economics, and a visiting fellow at Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford. Now, Inderjeet, the pandemic is accelerating the US decline. We're also seeing that the US-China confrontation is becoming sharper, shaking up the very roots of international political economy. The American conservatives, who were once the biggest promoters of globalization, now form the most virulent anti-globalist brigade. Racism and nationalism are on the rise, and the so-called liberal international order is gasping for last breath. So my first question to you, Inderjeet, is, in such a grim scenario, in which direction do you think that the American paleo-conservatives are taking their country?
Thank you, Atul, for that question. I think I would just take a little bit of issue with some of your introductory remarks, particularly about conservatives as the leading force behind globalization. I think broadly speaking, traditional conservatives have been much more nationalistic and protectionist and have had to be persuaded really from the 1940s onwards about globalism. And a bipartisan consensus had developed in the mainstream leadership of the Republican Party and with that of the Democrats behind internationalism, liberal internationalism, and then later on from the late 1980s, globalization. So, but on the wings of the conservative movement, there were always those who were much more nationalistic and far more skeptical about America's global military footprint, global intervention. They were much more supportive of national interest, if you like, or vital interest. So I think to say that the conservatives were the driving force, you have to look at different wings of conservatism, but the more centrist conservatives were certainly part of that. But even if you remember the period of Reagan, for example, you see there, at one hand, you have internationalism and an attachment to a liberal international order. But on the other hand, you also have a very, very powerful protectionist tendency, and particularly a lot of challenges to Japan and the rise of Japan, the possibility that US decline and Japanese rise were connected, and that Japan was going to be a kind of new hegemon. So I think there's that issue. But in regard to the conservatives, and I think that follows on from what I'm saying, is that, if you like, the paleo-conservatives are really quite old-style, old-fashioned Christian, nationalist, protectionist conservatives, opposed to immigration, particularly non-white immigration, and opposed to multiculturalism and the whole kind of idea of dilution of a kind of core American culture, very heavily constitutionalist and Republican, if you like, and to a degree populist, particularly among white Americans. What Trump has done, if you like, he has taken on board quite a large part of that kind of paleo-conservatism, but he's kind of reinterpreted it to some extent to be applied to a global power. So that in that regard, President Trump hasn't rejected globalization or globalism, but he has recalibrated the methodology and the attitude towards it such that it's become much more coercive, so that every aspect of American power, whether it's the dollar or its trade, the American market or investment, its role in financing international institutions, its attitude towards international law. Everything is to do with how does this serve America's interests in a zero-sum game, as opposed to a kind of hegemonic leadership building strategy, which said we have to build alliances. And if we're going to build alliances, we have to therefore give our allies and our partners something from this relationship too. And I think what Trump has done has effectively zeroed in on a kind of national Darwinist element of globalism. So they're not retreating from the world. They're not retreating in an isolationistic way, as traditional paleoconservatives would have wished. They've got quite a lot of the attitudes of the paleoconservatives, but they've got a bit of neoconservatism in there too. But neoconservatism without the morality, without the values, but with a lot of muscle. So it's a very hard power, national Darwinist, survival of the fittest, exertion of America's power of every kind, whether it's military power, but especially its financial and economic power as well.
So if I ask you the next question, which is, do the conservatives want America to be absolutely free of non-whites? Or are they insisting on kind of a ghettoization of minorities, building sort of separate ethno clusters where different laws apply to different communities?
No, I don't think that is the case. I mean, first of all, the idea of a non-white, a whites-only America would require the deportation or repatriation to Africa and other parts of the world of a very large proportion of the population, which in 20 years' time is actually going to be the majority of the population of the United States. So without a massive ethnic cleansing strategy, that is not going to be possible. And I do not think that is even on the cards in any practical political way, although there are those on the fascistic alt-right who talk about peaceful ethnic cleansing. And I think what they're really referring to there is the subordination, is the end of immigration, the deportation of quite a lot of immigrants as far as they possibly can, but more broadly, the subordination of the political influence and cultural influence of non-whites in particular. So I think what they want to try to do is to, through say voter suppression, through other means, is to try to silence and subordinate the voice of non-white Americans and try to empower the whole idea that America is a white country and that it stands largely for white Americans. And I think that kind of element of populism is an important part of it. But there is no constituency in the United States among white people of any significant value which is for white supremacy in the open sense. That constituency is gone. So when, for example, President Trump talked after Charlottesville and the neo-Nazi marches there about the equivalence between neo-Nazis and anti-fascists, the vast majority of the Republican Party leadership and public opinion condemned what he said there. They also condemned when he talked about African countries, being shithole countries and immigrants from there and so on, and how he lauded the virtues of, Norwegians and so on. There was a massive backlash against that. And now, more recently, with the George Floyd killing by the police, you can see right across American cross-section of opinion, there's a real opposition to that idea of police violence against African Americans, and a feeling that, a very widespread feeling actually, according to opinion polls, that violence is totally unjust and it needs to be sorted out. And a feeling also amongst maybe 2/3 of Americans that America's heading in the wrong direction. So I don't think there's any political program overtly, but what there is a subterranean program which is racially coded, which has been there probably since the late 1960s into the 1970s, of using other words when you talk about race. So you talk about crime or the war on drugs or welfare or taxation and so on. And that is usually directed in effect at African Americans and minority communities. But there is no constituency for white supremacy. in the
So
United States.
if you see these paleo-conservatives also claim, to be populist, and so do you think are there promises to the white working classes really genuine in any manner?
Well, I think a large part of it is populist rhetorical appeals to white America in general, and they have to sort of try to do something to appeal to white working class voters. But actually, if you look back to the period of Reagan, Reagan received something like 27% of his total support from white working class voters. President Trump received about 30% of his support from white working class voters. Mitt Romney received about 30 or 31% too. So the white working class backing for Trump is a long-term thing special to Donald Trump. So, but he has tried to build a coalition, but he hasn't been particularly successful in winning new white working class voters to his base. But he's had to have that kind of rhetorical appeal. And a lot of it is to do with how China has raped the Midwest industrial heartlands and so on, and that he's going to restore manufacturing jobs back to the United States. But actually, when you look at it, globalization and the rise of China was one source of lost jobs in the West and in the United States as well. But so was automation. Automation was a very powerful factor in the loss of manufacturing jobs, so that even if you decouple from the manufacturing goods trade with the US, those jobs are not going to come back as manufacturing jobs for large numbers of people who are unemployed in that sector, because they're going to be heavily automated if they do come back. And what we've seen thus far is that there hasn't been a return of those kind of jobs. What's happened is, to some extent, those jobs have been shifted to other parts of Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So it's a rhetorical populist appeal to try to win that support, but the majority of Trump's support has come from relatively affluent white Americans, not from the working class.
Okay, so that brings me to my last question, since we're having a very crisp interview today. What is the kind of world order that a paleo-conservative envisages? If you actually see, he's very keen to dismantle the liberal international order. But the same liberal international order is also being responsible for establishing the white prestige in the world. So why should a paleo-conservative be keen on destruction of this order, which has actually helped America, helped the whites to grow across the world?
I think that's a really great question. And I think you've got to go back to the origins of the liberal international order, particularly during the Second World War and after 1945. And clearly it's an outgrowth of the Anglo-American system. So the British Empire converting into a commonwealth over time and decolonizing, and a new relationship of neocolonialism with its old empire. And the United States as a very heavily kind of white supremacist kind of society, but which had to submerge, both of those countries really had to submerge that overt racism, which fueled colonialism and so on, under a new kind of idea of sovereign equality of nations. Because as you know, during the Cold War, there's a great competition between Russia, China as revolutionary powers, appealing to anti-colonial forces and opposed to those colonial forces, and arguing that those colonial forces were racist, colonial, imperial, hierarchical, and so on. So a large part, and also the Second World War was an anti-Nazi war, at least in part, and it was against, therefore, race theories of superiority and so on. So those dented the ability of overt white supremacy being an overt part of the liberal order. But nevertheless, they were submerged within it. And to some extent, the structural power of the West, of the white West, continued to operate through development, through aid, as opposed to colonialism, for example, neocolonialism. And of course, it did establish a very powerful position. But at the same time, that very system had within it a kind of basic liberal appeal too, which was it set up a system of sovereign states in the United Nations and so on, for example, and that is therefore that system is broadly open for others to join on a racially equal basis. So it was a step forward from the previous order because it did allow a position for non-white states, and in that development of that order, that system in the 1970s, for example, and then through the formation of the BRICS, was opened up a great deal through the development of some of the global South Third World states as well. So the liberal international order, if you like, had in principle an open principle, but it also had embedded in it white Western power, but that was increasingly challenged. And that's where I think the paleo-conservatives plus, and I would say that that's what Trump is a paleo-conservative plus, because what he's trying to do is to, if you like, is to challenge the relative increased power of non-Western countries, but also the European Union as well, as opposed to the United States. And so what he's trying to do is to rebalance the global balance of power in the favor of the United States against all competitors, partners, allies, rivals, and so on. And that's where I think the national Darwinist element of his kind of a paleo-conservatism is very, very powerful. It's basically saying we're going out there, we're no longer subsidizing through a hegemonic order other powers, international institutions which don't do what we want. And that's where, therefore, that explains its attitude towards the European Union in trying to extract a lot of value from it. But it's not a breakaway from globalization. If you look at the relationship with China, for example, with trade, the whole point of it is that China should buy more American goods, that China should invest more in the United States, and the US should be allowed to invest much more freely, and without intellectual property being passed to the Chinese in China itself. That is not anti-globalization. What it's saying is that the terms on which this trade takes place needs to shift in favor of the United States in order to subordinate rivals, competitors, allies, and partners. And I think that's where the Trump conservatism, which is old traditional conservatism, Christian, nationalist, protectionist, anti-immigrant, but on a global scale. It says, America's a fortress, America's a great powerhouse, and we want to extract as much value for America as we possibly can at the expense of others. It's not a hegemonic sharing of power of public goods. It's basically a transactionalist zero-sum game on a global scale.
Thank you so much, Inderjeet. It's been lovely chatting with you and on this important issue. And we'll come back soon. Thank you so much.
Okay.